But let's take a look at what has happened, because if you have a Parler account this morning, you don't have a Parler account this morning. And this is really the technocracy that we've been talking about for quite some time, flexing their muscle, taking it to the next level. And of course, this began 2.5 years ago, the purge of Alex Jones, InfoWars, and most of our accounts, all at the same time. And now we've seen that same kind of coordinated attack, and the justification for it is just as unjustified as their justification for removing Alex Jones and InfoWars. And yet, for 2.5 years, we've been telling President Trump and others, if you don't do something about this, they're going to do it to you. And I said very clearly, I said, if President Trump doesn't move to another platform, they will kick him off at the end of his term when he's done. Well, it's about 2 weeks before that. But I said, they're going to absolutely come for all of these people, because they do come for the powerful. That is, in a revolution, the people who are the opposing party are the ones who are put up against the wall and shot. And so that's, these people don't defend our freedoms. That same thing is going to happen to them, unless they have been compliant enough with the people who are taking power. So Google first removed Parler from the App Store, their App Store for Android. And then Apple said, you've got 24 hours to prove to us that you're going to moderate to our satisfaction. And if you don't, we're going to pull you off the Apple Store. Now, getting pulled off of the Google Store is not a fatal issue, because you don't have to go through the Google Play Store. It's not the only way that you can put an app on your Android phone. You can put it on in other ways. You can do it with side loading. There are alternative app stores that manually load the software without going through the App Store. But with the Apple platform, with the iOS, the iPhone, you must go through their store. You must go through their store. And the fact that they would tell them, you do this, and you prove to me that you're going to moderate to my satisfaction, and you do it within 24 hours. This is, I'm waiting to see how the Heritage Foundation and Reason Magazine will try to justify this in the name of private ownership. This is a corporation acting as government. They're making the rules. They're enforcing the rules. They are the rulers. They are the rulers of free speech on the internet, because they're doing this. So the Parler app will not be removed from users' phones as far as Google goes, and you'll still be able to put it on with other third parties. But as the Parler CEO said in June, he said, we're a community town square. Where have you heard this before? Jack Dorsey used to say that about Twitter. As a matter of fact, as all of these hearings were taking place in the wake of the banning of Alex Jones and InfoWars, Jack Dorsey said it 8 times, again, under oath. No, we're the town square. And here's what Parler said when they were launched 2 years ago. They said, we're a community town square, an open town square with no censorship. If you can say it on the streets of New York, you can say it on Parler. Well, that's a pretty broad standard. A lot of stuff is said on the streets of New York. But that's the way it ought to be. And that's the way that Twitter was. And then Twitter changed their terms of service, which is, first of all, fraudulent. And for people who have invested time and money in it, it is tortious interference. In other words, it is something that is you can take legal action against. But then they have this, Section 230, which gives them some privileges and immunity from the government, theoretically. But Parler did not change. Twitter did change, however. And this is what Google said. They said, in order to protect user safety, they had to shut down free speech. So it's always safety that is used to take our freedom, isn't it? The promise of safety. Do you feel safer now that you can't get to Parler? Or do you feel like there's some kind of a massive technocratic elite that are going to take everything away from you, starting with your free speech, of course? Yeah, it's kind of a paternalism, isn't it? Isn't paternalism patriarchal? Don't they hate that kind of stuff? No. It's just authoritarian big brother. Yeah, big brother. We don't want to say big daddy. It's a big brother. But, it's kind of funny because talking about paternalism and daddies. It was GoDaddy that did this to Gab back in 2018. I'll talk about what's going on with Gab here in a minute. Gab had their app taken away in 2018. Gab was dehosted in 2018 as well. And now Parler has been kicked off by Amazon. So Google and Apple and Amazon, all of them came after Parler in just 24 hours to kick it off. As they're booted off, I got to say that the justification, as Amazon, BuzzFeed says, well, look at this. This is a particular tweet that went out, and this is why Amazon was so concerned about this and booting Parler off of its web hosting services. So they curated a couple of pictures. One of them says, violence works, make them afraid, shows people cowering down on benches. And then there were some other ones, I'm just saying, maybe we ought to go get this person or arrest that person or bring some guns or whatever. And that is dangerous speech. And if it is a crime, then what you do is you report it to law enforcement, and maybe they would do something about it. But you don't have the authority to be law enforcement unless you've taken on the role of government, which they have. But then just think about this. Let's just suppose that instead of it being, I don't know, some John Deere wearing Junior Samples, if you remember Hee-Haw, instead of it being Junior Samples on his Junior at BR549 account, let's imagine that it was some bot account run by the CIA. And maybe they go to a platform like Parler and put up a bunch of garbage and then go to, I don't know, maybe Oliver Darcy at CNN or some other snitch that just specializes in trying to shut down his competition of free speech and anybody that he disagrees with, and publicize this and say, look at what is being allowed on that platform. Well, that would be a very effective way for them to shut down anybody that they don't like who is telling the truth about government, because understand that the only thing dangerous, the only people that free speech is a danger to are governments and corporations who act like government, corporations who now have become government. That's what a technocracy is. And so if you want to put stuff up like that, you could do it as, you could blame these people and shut them down if you're a government agency, or it could be that maybe you're Twitter and you're concerned about one of these competitors, or you're concerned about Parler, or you're concerned about Gab, and so you could do a little bit of corporate dirty tricks to put that kind of stuff up, and then call the usual snitches to publicize it. This is a precedent that's now been set. If there is something that is dangerous there, then they could suspend that content and they could tell law enforcement about it, and law enforcement could go through something that we call due process. But they don't want that. Dan Bongino really hit it on the head. Now, Dan Bongino has an interest. He's not the money behind this. It was the Mercer family, these Republican billionaires who bankrolled it. Dan Bongino bought a big share in it, he said, this last summer. And so when he went on Fox News with Sean Hannity, Dan Bongino got it precisely as to what's happening. He says, I'm not making a First Amendment argument for you here. These are private companies. I'm making an even more dangerous argument that these tech companies are more powerful than the government, and they will have more pernicious effect on civil liberties by engaging in open war with free speech, as they're doing right now. He said, at least with the government, you have a process. Well, as long as they don't red flag you. As long as they don't take the gun and do the due process later, as President Trump said. Or as long as they don't tell you, as President Trump said, they got to take the shot about MMR. And don't tell me for a minute that if Trump didn't have another 4 years, that he wouldn't be doing that with the vaccine that he is so proud of. Oh, absolutely he would. But they love to do these things through corporations because it gives them plausible deniability. Just like the CIA would always say, oh, well, we're not the CIA, we're a company. That's why they even called it the company. Air America, whatever else. I mean, they always pretended that they were a private company. But now they actually use private companies. They created their venture capital firm to give a start to people that they knew would be manipulatable, and they did it to a lot of different companies, and then they let them compete with each other to see which ones would be the strongest. But they seeded a lot of them, and they gave them money so that they could operate for free for a very long time to get everybody into this mode of operating, as some people pointed out. It was only a few years ago that we didn't even use social media, right? I signed up for Twitter in 2012, but I didn't really use it much for the first, 3 or 4 years. And now they've gotten everybody using these social media things, and we forget that there's such a thing as being able to go directly to a website or look stuff up for ourselves. But that's what they have done. But he's exactly right. He's not talking about a First Amendment argument. He's saying these private companies have become governmental agencies. It's a technocracy. And you don't have a stake in this stakeholder capitalism. You don't have a say in this, and you don't have due process. The Parler CEO says his service was dropped by every vendor, and it could end his business. He said every vendor, from text message services to email providers to our lawyers, all ditched us on the same day. Well, yeah, again, we've been there, saw that happen at InfoWars 2.5 years ago. And now you got people like Oliver Darcy extending this. Oliver Darcy, who at the beginning of this was totally focused on InfoWars. This guy, the so-called journalist, he's got a piece up on CNN, analysis. Darcy is not an analyst. He's a hack. He's nothing but a snitch, a hack, somebody who can't hack it in the free marketplace of ideas, and somebody from a network that can't hack it in the marketplace in terms of competition. So he's out there now coming after Newsmax, One America News, and yes, he says, Fox News. And he's going around doing the same things. It's the same tactic that he began with InfoWars and Alex Jones back in 2018. Going around all these different companies that you do business with. And I'm sure that he was probably instrumental in doing this at Parler at the same time, a couple of weeks ago. Do you know that there's harmful content being pushed out by Fox News and all of my conservative competitors? Are you okay with this? Because, there's a mob out here that wants to cancel your business if you are. Trying to put pressure on them to do this. TV providers, he says, in his so-called analysis, TV providers should not escape scrutiny for distributing disinformation. Would that apply to CNN? Oh, of course not, because in his mind, CNN never says anything wrong. So who gets to decide what is disinformation, what is right and wrong? Not you. No, it'll be decided by Oliver Darcy. Fox and Newsmax, both delivered to my home by your company, are complicit, said a New Jersey state assemblyman, Paul Moriarty. He sent that to a Comcast executive on Thursday. So that's how Darcy uses this. It's not an analysis. It's an attack. It's an attack on free speech. He said that Moriarty, the New Jersey state assemblyman, said to Comcast, "You feed this garbage, lies and all, to the public." Darcy says, "We regularly discuss what the big tech companies have done to poison public conversation by providing large platforms to bad faith actors who lie and mislead." And so what he's saying is that for the longest period of time, translate that Orwellian doublespeak, for the longest period of time, they've been coming after social media for censorship, because anybody that doesn't say what he does is a person who's engaging in lies, misleading, and disinformation, and so they have to be taken away. But then he says, what about Newsmax, One America, and yes, even Fox News? He said the lies that Fox, Newsmax, and OAN spread that helped to prime Trump's supporters into not believing the truth, that he lost an honest and fair election. Yeah, there you go. Who would ever think that there was an election that was not honest and fair? Anybody who's ever participated in the process, that's who. Anybody who's ever seen it close up, who understands how the sausage is made. He says, yes, Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson and Mark Levin and others are responsible for the lies that they peddle to the audiences. Let me tell you, the only one who really understood from the very beginning of this where this was headed was Tucker Carlson. He knew 2.5 years ago where this would go and where CNN would go if they weren't stopped. And so, I got to say that I wouldn't argue for the censorship even of a vile authoritarian journalist hack like Oliver Darcy. No, I think he ought to be out there. I think it's important for us to see the lies of these people and to be able to oppose them, and that's what he doesn't want. He can't win this argument. He doesn't have a leg to stand on. The only way, just like the rest of this cancel mob, that he can survive, that he can thrive and prosper, is with authoritarian censorship. So he goes on, he says, are there any rules? And again, what rules? Who are the people that are going to make the rules? Well, he wants it to be done by these companies. He said, what about cable carriers? It's hard, for instance, to imagine that they'd carry a fringe and conspiratorial network like InfoWars. So why do AT&T, CenturyLink, Verizon carry OAN? Why do AT&T, CenturyLink, Verizon, Comcast, Charter, and Dish carry Newsmax? Why do they carry Fox? And you might ask, why do all the airports have CNN? It's because CNN pays them to put their news. It's not because they want it. It's not because it's good. It's not because of demand. It's because they pay them to put it up. So Oliver Darcy, is part of his, journalism or analysis. He goes around asking all these companies. He's a little social activist for censorship. I asked all these companies for comment on Thursday. I asked them if they have any guidelines governing the content that they carry on the platform. I asked them, do they have any regret over carrying right-wing channels? And only CenturyLink provided a comment. They said they were committed to providing, quote, a variety of broadcast channels covering thousands of topics. Oh, he doesn't like that. You shouldn't have any kind of informed consent about what vaccine you're going to put into your body. All these people say they're pro-choice. They don't want you to have a choice in news. They don't want you to have a choice about your actual body. No. They want you to choose to kill your children. That's the only choice that they support anywhere. No choice about how you're going to educate your child or what kind of medical procedures or medicines you're going to have for you or for your children. No. The only choice is that you should kill your child. They want to do everything they can to make you have that choice. But every other choice, when it really is your body, where it really is your choice to be able to see information, they want to take that away from you. So he said he was very upset because AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, Charter, and Dish didn't even reply to him. They just said, get lost, essentially, to Darcy, which is what they all ought to do. But he said, at least Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have acknowledged that they've got something to do, and they've been doing it exactly the way that Oliver Darcy wants it done. Glenn Greenwald, a real journalist, blasted big tech for censoring unilaterally with no standard, accountability, or appeal, as he put it. He did it on Twitter. Journalist Glenn Greenwald has criticized Silicon Valley tech companies, writes Breitbart, for increased censorship. He expects the masters of the universe, that's what Breitbart calls them. I just call them technocrats because that's what they call themselves. This has been around for a very long time. And I talked about how popular this was back in the 1930s. You had H.G. Wells and other people talking about that, things to come, the shape of things to come, the book, the film. You've seen that. I've talked about that many times. The idea that a technocratic elite should tell us all how we should live our lives because we're a bunch of brutes, deplorables, we're non-essential, and we need to be told. And if they have the technology, they can force us. That's the idea behind H.G. Wells. They had superior technology. They called themselves the airmen, and they could do whatever they wanted to these so-called tribal leaders. But at the same time that was happening in fiction, there was a big movement. Somebody actually worked to make that happen in real life in the 1930s, and that was Elon Musk's grandfather, Joshua Haldane. And he was brought up on charges because he tried to overthrow the Canadian democracy. And I think it's Haldane. Was it Haldane or Haldeman? Anyway, you can check me on that, but it's one of those two if you want to look it up. Remember his first name. And Elon Musk and his family, after he beat the rap, they beat it out of Canada. They went to South America. And that's why Elon Musk is coming back from South America. So they got out of Dodge for 2 generations, and they came back to bring in the technocracy. Greenwald expects these technocrats to quickly escalate their censorship as the belief that, quote, tech oligarchs should police our discourse is a virtual consensus. And that's the saddest thing about it, isn't it? Why is it a virtual consensus? It is a virtual consensus because most of the so-called journalists like Oliver Darcy have sold their soul to these people. They have so much money, if they toady up to them, it's a ticket for them in the future. Greenwald's tweets can be seen on Twitter still. They haven't pulled him off. He responded to a report that Michelle Obama called on tech companies to permanently ban President Trump and to put policies in place, quote, to prevent their technology from being used by the nation's leaders to fuel insurrection. And what we're talking about here is really putting in place a state of permanent corporate martial law. And just as we see with the lockdown, you are guilty until you prove that you are compliant. And that's the way these people are going to operate. It's going to be, this censorship is a pre-crime, a Minority Report type of action. If they think that you might be the type of person who would say the wrong thing or whatever, you have to prove otherwise or you're preemptively taken off. So Glenn Greenwald responded to what Michelle Obama was saying by saying a handful of Silicon Valley oligarchs decide who can and cannot be heard, including the President of the United States. They exert this power unilaterally with no standards, with no accountability, with no appeal. Politics is now begging them to silence adversaries or to permit allies to speak. And this is the saddest thing about it. This technocracy that has happened here is also an impotence of both the Republicans and the Democrats. In a sense, it's not really impotence on the Democrats' side. The Democrats are just using them, as I said before, as plausible deniability. It's a hidden hand. But understand that behind both the Democrats and the Republicans is the military-industrial complex. And it was back in 2017 that Clint Watts went on to one of these little shows that they put on in Congress. You know, we've had a lot of these shows, haven't we, in the last 4 years? Let's have a congressional hearing. We'll have a hearing to talk about how the Russians put President Trump in office. And of course, there was nothing to that, but there was also nothing to the pushback by the Republicans saying, well, let's look and see who put together this coup. They would have hearings and they would get in front of the cameras and they would talk to their constituents back home to pretend that they were actually going to do something about this, and nothing was ever done. But after one of these show hearings, one of these pageants, as the people from Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, Google, had after they left, Clint Watts came in, and he was a guy who worked with the military-industrial complex. He's been in military intelligence. He's been with these other agencies, and that was in October, late October of 2017. In July of 2017, they had set up what they call a transatlantic organization, and I've got this written down here somewhere. I don't have it on this sheet of paper. I forget the name of the organization right now. I'll get to it in a second. But they created it in July. And then 3 months later, he's there at Congress, and he's saying, we have a civil war that has already started, the battlefield of social media. We have to silence the cannons on social media, or the nation will be divided, and so we have to have censorship. And that was not reported by the mainstream media. But it happened nevertheless. And then that was October, late October. In August of the following year, they made it happen. And they've been escalating it ever since. And this is the latest example. And so when we look at the fact that they are now acting as government, the government has failed to act on any of this, failed to put them in check, failed to do anything about this. And as I've said many times, and we've seen what's happened this last week, as President Trump was banned and shut down on Twitter, and he moved to these other platforms, to Parler, to Gab, you could see what happened. It was disorderly because if President Trump had done this, and I've been saying this forever, I read you somebody else saying the same thing last week. President Trump doesn't have to use any of his presidential powers. He could use just his celebrity status as being president, or somebody that has essentially made Twitter, and he could have moved to another platform. And if he would have done it before they kicked him off, then it wouldn't have essentially bricked these other platforms. On Gab, there's so much activity that I can barely use it. Most of the time, I get a message saying that there's a DDoS. And when I saw that initially over the weekend, I saw that with Parler, I saw it with Gab, and then we saw it with some other websites. And so I contacted somebody that works in cybersecurity. I said, "Are you seeing anything?" And he goes, "Yeah, all kinds of things are going down, different places." I don't know if that was just stress of so much activity on the internet, or if there really was an additional DDoS, or in addition to the massive surge of people moving from one platform to the other. I don't know what happened with it, but I know that it is still persisting. It may have just been those two sites. I mean, there were other sites that went down. As I was talking to him, he had to go because some other stuff went down. So there was something else that was happening, at least for a while there. But this has persisted with these two sites until Parler went down, that it was difficult to use them because of the traffic. Now, if President Trump had thought about this, if there was, I don't know, what would we call it? A plan? If there was a plan, if we could trust a plan, if he had a plan, he could have thought, well, you know what? I'm going to stop the censorship for the American people, or maybe I'll just do it for myself, right? And he could have talked to these people behind, closed doors and said, beef up your infrastructure here because I'm going to make a public announcement and move in a week or 2 weeks or a month or whatever. Give them some time to prepare. Instead, all of this happens. He's not prepared whatsoever for it, and it turns into total chaos. Still having a problem every time I try to post anything on Gab. I'll talk about what's going on with that in a second here. But going back to what Glenn Greenwald has to say, he said, this whole thing is particularly menacing because they're just not like any other companies with competitors. Even a Democrat-controlled House subcommittee just 3 months ago definitively concluded that 4 of them, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple, are classic monopolies. These are some of the biggest corporations that the world has ever seen. Each of them. I mean, think about that. Amazon and Google and all, these, the world has never seen companies like this. And Apple, and they're conspiring together to first take down InfoWars. Now they're taking down Parler, and they're going to go after, if Darcy is correct, they're going to go after these other platforms as well. They have so much money, so much power, so much technology that they can do this against anybody. And I think in this move against Parler, they didn't put down Twitter as having a monopoly. Why don't they have a monopoly? Well, because you have Parler and you have Gab. So what are they doing? They're going after Parler and Gab to give Twitter a monopoly as well.